Hi, my name is Toni Burkhalter, and as you know, I'm your sport and exercise nutrition instructor. And what I want to do is walk you through some information about adolescence when it comes to sport and exercise nutrition. So I found this information from a fabulous book entitled Nutrition Guide for Physicians and Related Healthcare Professionals. I chose the chapter that was most pertinent to our class and specific to adolescence in sport and exercise nutrition. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start by defining what an adolescent is. So very easily stated, an adolescent is a young person in the process of transitioning from a child to an adult. And when that happens is somewhat dependent on the individual. According to the World Health Organization, which is a very reputable source, they define an adolescent as someone who's between the ages of 10 and 19 years old. So they're the individuals who are kind of going through puberty, if you might say it that way. And there are some unique characteristics to adolescence. If you've ever lived with one, you know that. If you've ever run into one as a niece or a nephew, you know that too. If you've ever been one, you recognize that there are rapid changes in the body that often lead to a dissatisfaction with the body. With adolescence, there's also that risk for disordered eating, which couples with that dissatisfaction with the body. Additionally, they have a little more control over their lives, which may mean that they do things like meal skip that they wouldn't have the opportunity to do or the desire to do earlier in their younger life. With health screenings, you can look at their BMI, which is a height to weight ratio, and oftentimes doctors will look at that. They also may do assessments for type 2 diabetes, and they can even start doing cardiovascular disease risk assessments in these individuals. So when we're looking at nutrition during these developmental years, we need to keep in mind all these changes that are occurring. For example, there is a marked height increase during adolescence, 9.5 inches in height increase in an average female, a foot increase or 12-inch increase in the average male. We also have weight changes associated with this. With females, they gain about 18 pounds per year during a very active growth spurt. And with males, they gain about 20 pounds per year during a very active growth spurt. So you can see this is a very dynamic time of change in the adolescent's body as well as in their mind. During these developmental years, we also see significant body composition changes. Females increase body fat pretty substantially because they're having an increase in adiposity or fat tissue in the breast as well as in the hips as they go through puberty. On the flip side, males actually decrease their body fat because they're increasing their muscle mass. So as a percentage of their overall weight, the body fat percent decreases. When we look at the skeletal system, we notice that the bone mass is going to increase. There's a significant increase in bone mass as well. So until age 16 in young women, we see this rapid increase in bone mass. Until about age 20 in young men, we see this rapid increase in bone mass. And in fact, we have about 50% of adult bone mass gained in this period of adolescence, which means that these individuals are very nutritionally sensitive to malnutrition if they're not consuming enough of the nutrients needed to facilitate both the body composition changes, the height increase, and the bone mass increase. So the question may be, how are these adolescents doing nutritionally? If you've sat down to dinner with any one of them, or if you've seen them running by on their way to classes, you'll notice they're not doing so good. As a group of individuals, they're deficient in folic acid or folate. They're deficient in vitamin A. They're low in vitamin B6, vitamin C, and even vitamin E. And on top of that, they have low fiber consumption because they're not consuming delicious, nutritious fruits and vegetables at the rate that they otherwise had been in the past. So you might be thinking, well, they must be consuming enough of some of the things, right? Well, I guess so. They consume enough or too much total fat. They consume enough or too much saturated fat, sodium, and added sugar. So with that in mind, it may not be too surprising to learn that less than 20% of teens actually meet their vegetable recommendations, and less than 25% of teens meet their fruit recommendations. So what's contributing to these problems? Well, like I mentioned before, they have a little more say over their life. They have a little more say over what they're consuming, and they get to choose what they do with their free time. With these things combined, We mentioned before that there's meal skipping. And if we want to look at the statistics, over 25% of teens skip breakfast on an average day, and about 25% of teens skip lunch. And 8% even skip dinner. So meal skipping, when you're doing that, makes you hungry. It makes you grab something that's really convenient on the go, which means that it's leading to some unhealthy snacking at times. And with the statistics being in place of 80% of the teens snacking during the day, it's no surprise that 25% of their calories are coming from these snacks. And very, very unfortunately, soda, candy machine snacks account for a large portion of that, and soda accounts for 9% of daily calories in these teens. So not an insignificant number of calories. So with the body dissatisfaction comes dieting. And over 50% of adolescent girls are dieting. They state that, yes, I am dieting at this time. Over 25% of adolescent boys are dieting. And this becomes very concerning, as dieting can be associated with fatigue, impaired growth, impaired sexual maturation, irritability, impulse to binge on foods that aren't the healthiest, and an increased risk of disordered eating. So this becomes of particular concern when you start talking about an adolescent athlete. This athlete is trying to optimize their training and optimize recovery, but without proper nutrition, they cannot do that. And because they're an athlete and they're practicing possibly morning, afternoon, and evening, or even if they're only training one time during the day, they have an increased nutrition and energy need. So it puts them at higher risk for malnutrition with this increased need and their poor eating habits. So how do we best fuel our adolescent athletes? Well, pre-event or pre-exercise, we should have them eat a meal about 2 to 3 hours prior. We want them to avoid foods high in fat, very high in protein, and or high in dietary fiber, because it tends to, we'll just say, make the intestinal system not as happy during that time, as well as the fact it's not fueling them in the best way possible. So we want to have foods that are higher in healthy carbohydrates. We want this athlete to also consume 6 to 8 ounces of fluid a couple hours before that exercise as well. During the exercise, we want to encourage them to continue to consume fluids. In fact, 4 to 6 ounces of fluid every 15 or 20 minutes of physical activity is desired. We don't want them to go 2 hours without having anything to drink and then all of a sudden chug a lot of water or Gatorade. That can actually lead to some pretty significant problems, which we'll discuss later in the semester. Post-event or post-exercise, we want to encourage them to eat a meal that has about 400 to 600 calories, ample amounts of healthy high carbohydrate foods, and adequate non-caffeinated fluids, and we want to make sure they're having at least 8 ounces of fluid during that meal itself. So what about performance-enhancing items? Nutritional ergogenic aids are any foodstuff that can be used for the purposes of enhancing performance. So some examples include protein or amino acid powders, creatine, caffeine, carnitine, anabolic steroids or anabolic steroid precursors, beta-hydroxy, beta-methylbutyrate, growth hormone or GH, and Xenadrin. These are not always needed, safe, or even effective. So it becomes a big concern with our growing athletes during these sensitive years. But how are adolescents really using? Are they using much, or are they using to a level that's concerning? Well, I think any level of some of these is concerning. And the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey and other US data reveal that steroids are used by up to 6% of males and 5% of female adolescents, with the use peaking in the 9th grade or your freshman year of high school. The thing that's even scarier is that these are often supplied by coaches while the students are not in season. So they're giving them oral administration, injectables, or even transdermal patches. So the question then becomes, but won't these students get caught, or won't the coaches get caught? Well, although many of these aids are forbidden by the National Collegiate Athletic Association or the NCAA, few high school athletic programs will even test. So these high school coaches don't really think too much about it at times, or even the high school athletes may not be as concerned either. So if I'm going to tell you more about these aids, I want to stop and tell you that steroids have many negative side effects. Sometimes people only think about, oh, it's going to increase my strength, or I'm going to have hypertrophy. However, some of these side effects are permanent, such as infertility. We can also have problems like hypertension, epiphyseal closure, and as a reminder, what that is where you have your growth plates. They continue to have an increase in deposition of bone tissue so the bones can grow longer. Well, if we're taking steroids too early, what can happen is we can have calcification of that growth plate or that epiphyseal closure, and therefore it can actually stunt growth. We can have depression, we can have aggression, all of these associated with steroid use. If someone's taking DHEA, which is an over-the-counter supplement, but they're consuming it without consulting with their parents, with their doctor, or other individuals, you start seeing problems as well. With men, they have an irreversible growth of the breast tissue or gynecomastia. We see prostate enlargement, and those two can really only be reversed significantly by having surgery. In women, we have an increase in hairiness in the face and in the back. And if people are going to take things like growth hormone during adolescence, we can also see a situation where those growth plates are going to close prematurely, and it may negatively impact the growth of the individual. We have hyperlipidemia, insulin resistance, and we also have myopathy. And if you're taking creatine, which is an over-the-counter supplement, we're noticing that seems to be safe for very active adolescents, but we're seeing in other situations where there's no positive effect for a non-active adolescent. And the thing that we don't know is if we're continuing to take things like creatine or some other over-the-counter supplements for long periods of time, like 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20, even 30, what effect is that going to have on the athlete? And at this point, we're not totally sure. So my suggestion is, if you're considering your health and well-being, we don't necessarily know how some of these supplements are going to impact your health and well-being long-term. So what we want to do is support the adolescent athlete in their journey. Our goal as individuals in the field of nutrition should be to help them be the healthiest they can be. In my opinion, if we're helping them be the healthiest they can be, performance goals will follow. They'll achieve those goals. They'll be able to really do what they need to do on the field, on the court, and elsewhere. So as a brief overview, these adolescents have very unique needs. It's a time of significant cognitive development, rapid growth, new social pressures. They have sports performance goals like they've never had before, and they have unique aesthetic aspirations for themselves and their bodies. So as we close our discussion on adolescent nutrition with sport and exercise, I want to send a genuine thank you to the authors who have shared this information through their book, Nutrition Guide for Physicians and Related Healthcare Professionals. And as we continue the conversation either in person or online, I welcome you to share any other references that you think would be of value.